The Air India 171 preliminary crash report has just been released, and its contents are unexpected. The report answers all the most important questions, but poses a few new ones. Let's jump right into it. The captain of this flight held an ATPL, or Airline Transport Pilot's License, and had amassed over 15,000 hours. He had over 8,500 hours on this particular type of aircraft. The co-pilot, or first officer, only had a commercial pilot's license, and had amassed around 3,400 hours. Of that, about 1,100 of those hours were on this type of aircraft. All maintenance and aviation directives had been conformed with, meaning the plane was good to go. However, the pilots from the previous flight noted a stabilizer position transducer error. Maintenance had troubleshooted the error and eventually released the plane for flight. About 2 hours before the flight was to depart, the crew arrived and underwent a pre-flight breathalyzer test. The crew was well rested and ultimately were found fit to fly. The plane's weight was calculated to be within the takeoff limit, meaning it shouldn't have any problem flying. The airplane uneventfully taxied to the beginning of runway 23 and started its takeoff roll at 7 minutes and 37 seconds past 0800. From the wreckage, both enhanced airborne flight recorders were recovered, which is where we get the next bit of information. Both of these recorders independently record audio and flight data. This is different from older aircraft that only make one copy of each recording to each individual box. This has proven to be an excellent design decision, because the rear flight data recorder has been so badly damaged that they have yet to recover any data from it. But all of that information, including the cockpit audio and flight data, was recovered from the forward airborne flight recorder. But back to the accident sequence. The plane accelerated normally down the runway and achieved its rotation speed at about 1 minute after it started rolling. The aircraft sensors reported a takeoff about 1 minute and 2 seconds after the takeoff began. At this point in the flight, everything was normal. The flaps were correctly set to 5 degrees and were never altered during the entire flight. This was confirmed with the wreckage. The throttles remained in the toga position for the entire duration. The autopilot was never engaged. But here is where the story gets very interesting. 3 seconds after the plane took off, both engines' fuel cutoff switches were set to the cutoff position, but they weren't shut off simultaneously. There was about a 1 second gap between engine 1 and engine 2. This immediately started shutting down both of the engines, causing a complete loss of thrust. In the cockpit voice recorder, one of the pilots asks the other pilot why he did that. The other pilot then reported that he did not do so. At this time, we don't know which pilot asked and which responded. We do know that the co-pilot was the pilot flying and that the captain was the pilot monitoring. From unreleased airport camera footage, the ram air turbine was confirmed to be deployed immediately after liftoff. 8 seconds after liftoff, the ram air turbine was providing power for the aircraft. Over the next 10 seconds, both of the fuel cutoff switches were returned to the run position. Engine 1 did successfully relight, but never returned to its full engine power. Engine 2 also relit, but it was too far into the engine shutdown sequence. About 30 seconds after takeoff, one of the pilots transmitted "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," but the flight data recorders stopped recording seconds later. According to this preliminary report, the only anomaly during this flight was the shutoff of both of the engines. But that still begs the question, who did it? And why? But before we explore that, there's another bit of interesting information tucked deeply in this report. Boeing, the manufacturer of this 787 Dreamliner, shares various components between different aircraft types. These fuel shutoff switches are shared with the much maligned Boeing 737 aircraft. In 2018, the FAA issued a special airworthiness information bulletin about these particular switches. These switches feature a special locking mechanism that requires the switch to be pulled out before it can be moved to another position. Some operators of the Boeing 737 found that these switches did not have this locking mechanism engaged. That means that the switch may inadvertently be switched to the off position during flight. The FAA recommended that all operators check to ensure that this locking feature was working correctly. This particular aircraft had the throttle control assembly, which features these switches, replaced in 2019 and 2023. Air India never complied with the special airworthiness information bulletin as it wasn't a mandatory aviation directive. However, no defect was ever reported on this aircraft since the throttle control was replaced in 2023. It would be very peculiar for this to suddenly happen on both switches at the same time, but the investigators felt it was important enough to include in the preliminary report. If these switches were operating correctly, that still begs the question, why would somebody shut down these switches during takeoff? Nowhere in the report indicates that anybody other than the two pilots were in the cockpit. If there wasn't a silent jump seater, that only leaves the two pilots as the main suspects. Was this just a horrible accident? or was this deliberate? In 2015, Germanwings 9525 was brought down by a suicidal pilot. In 2023, a pilot riding in the jump seat attempted to pull the fire extinguishing handles on an Embraer. He blamed his actions on suffering from severe depression. We don't know anything about the specific pilots, but we do know that pilots' mental health is a hot topic in the industry. Many pilots avoid mental health intervention as it could permanently jeopardize their license and their livelihood. Those issues may be left to fester, often being exacerbated by substance abuse, including alcohol. At this time, all we know is that both of those switches were turned off 1 second apart from each other. We don't know if this was a mechanical malfunction, an intentional act, or just a simple mistake by the crew. The focus of the investigation will now be on those switches, whether they were working or not. They will also be looking into the background of both of the pilots. We will be keeping an eye on this investigation, so be sure to hit the subscribe button, and thank you to all the channel members who make these videos possible.